When Series 2 came around, more than just the card layout changed. The premier set, Magic Ruler, caused a magical meltdown with powerful new magic like Rush Recklessly, Acts of Despair, and Confiscation, just to name a few. While it was great for new duelists coming from the fresh anime and exciting Battle City arc in the manga, seasoned veterans were hysterical with the insurgency of power cards galore. Remember, due to the current state of the game, every card from this set was unlimited, Painful Choice, Mystical Space Typhoon, and yes, even the 3 Sacred Treasures. It created a scene where hand destruction ran rampant with minimal rogue options like Maha Vilo and deck destruction. It got to the point where less than a month later on May 15th, the first ever emergency list would drop. But this was kind of a weird one. Limited was Harpy's Feather Duster, and semi-limited was Snatch Steel. That's it. It wasn't much of an adjustment at all. Heavy Storm was static at 3, as was Typhoon and Trunade, in case you needed more back row removal. 2 Snatch Steels plus the limited change of heart were still plenty of robbery maneuvers, barring Magician of Faith plays, and the Sacred Treasures were yet unchecked, the clear main problem. Literally all 3 went ignored somehow. The only meaningful interaction that came from this was that now with more storms in the vicinity, duelists had to be more careful setting cards to play around hand rips. 3 days later, we'd receive something other than a core set, a reprint set that may have a familiar name to us TCG duelists. Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon is a box was hard to come by, so collectors certainly enjoyed seeing a Mador reprint. Even a card like Dark Hole here, or at least hyped up if you play with that secret rare Toon Dragon. But you forgot to side deck Dragon Capture.
Compared to what we got in TCG, where you simply paid 1,000 life points to activate it and let it be. Originally, the card requires the same cost, but you also must pay 500 life during your standby phase. And when World is sent to the graveyard, you get paid back whatever maintenance you spent. In activating this card, waiting a turn to attack, and the attack itself, looking at 2,000 life points spent on the first attack alone. And this is assuming you have access to World, which can't be directly searched out. Much like the designs, this deck is a joke. It is a risky, life heavy.
Tragic first archetype in Konami's Yu-Gi-Oh! Like Pegasus's deck, we would finally get ritual support here, buffing anyone who was playing Relinquished. Sonic Bird and Senju of the Thousand Hands could search ritual magic and a ritual monster respectively, making ritual builds more familiar than ever before. It helps that Pharaoh's Servant also included a few new rituals, including their accompanying ritual magic, which is something Magic Ruler failed to do. Even summoning the blue monsters was made easier thanks to a new steady stream of monsters called Recruiters. Upon their destruction, this new style of the first being Megamorph, which doubles the equipped monster's attack stat if your life is lower than the opponent's. If it's higher, then the equipped monster's attack gets cut in half. While Axe of Despair was still seen as solid, Megamorph was viewed as a higher ceiling card. It is specific, yet you can play cards like Solemn Judgment to reduce your life quickly, or even equip Megamorph to an opposing monster to make them weaker. Equip B duelists would certainly like this card, and even view potential plays with Cyberstein, another card that drastically reduced your life. Let's put a pin on that for now. The other big card would be Cyberjar, a flip Dark Hole with mass monster summoning and hand replenishment. It can generate a ton of advantage, but it gives your opponent cards too. Though due to the wording at the time, some regions weren't sure if non-monster cards milled were added to the hand or placed back in the deck. Quote, flip. Destroy all monsters on the field, flip over the top 5 cards of each player's deck, and place all level 4 or lower monster cards from among them onto the field in any display format. Unquote. It wouldn't be until 2002 where this was worded better, but this wasn't a widespread issue as most people understood what the card did. This buffed deck destruction since Jar advanced both your game plan and your resources. The deck out strategy didn't care as much if your opponent had a lot of cards. The deck out ruling played in your favor. Spear Cretin from Pharaoh's Servant could recur flips, giving you more leeway, though yet again, confusing text made people wonder if you could loop Cretin. Quote, flip. When this card is sent to the graveyard, you and your opponent choose one monster from the graveyard and play it onto the field. Unquote. At the time, the answer was yes, despite some saying it would be impossible, and Yu-Gi-Oh saying that if it's written on the card, there's no problem. Messenger of Peace from Servant also buffed deck destruction as a stall card with light maintenance. It wasn't only Pharaoh's Servant that duelists received that July day. They also got the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters 3 Tri-Holy God Advent promo cards. If you pre-ordered the game, you'd receive Duema's Dark Witch, a strong beater for light decks, or if you miss out on previous beaters, as I imagine plenty of new duelists did. There'd also be a game guide that came with Panther Warrior, another strong beater that was difficult to use due to its effect that required you to tribute a monster to attack, though perhaps you may be able to make use of it by tributing searchers or stolen monsters. Each game would come with the new Insect Queen, as well as a pack with a random assortment of 3 of the following cards. Alpha and Beta, the Magnet Warriors, Gamma and Valkyrion wouldn't be released until December, Cybertech Alligator, a summon skull type with better defense, Goblin Fan, a decent low-level flip hate, and Garba Sword with its ritual spell, making it a nice tool for ritual decks that want a little more range in meeting its level requirements than a level 8. We need more TCG prints of Garma Sword. The final 2 cards are certainly the power cards, Sinister Serpent and Widespread Ruin. Ruin would be a solid 1-for-1 battle trap that destroys your opponent's monster with the highest attack once said opponent declares an attack. As opposed to attack buffs, this trap just outright destroys a monster, and typically the annoying one, as this card would be a great tool against beatdown decks. Expect to see this side if you're piloting the aggro strategy. On the other hand, Sinister Serpent would act as an abusive salvage card. It returns to your hand during your standby phase, so it could combo beautifully with discard cards like Graceful Charity, Tribute to the Doomed, and Magic Jammer. Painful Choice was an excellent card too, as you could send 3 serpents to get access to a bunch of free cards. But be careful, as 3 serpents could be cloggy. Cannon Soldier can make use too, by comboing Ultimate Offering to inflict Burn Aplenty. Relinquish also enjoyed Serpent as an easy 1-star tribute fodder. Needless to say, Tri-Holy God Advent had a lot of cards from casually good to meta staples. Only 2 days later, Konami would announce their first true list adjustment. It was needed, as duelists were tender with disgust at the state of the current game. Thankfully, Konami took notice and made a stronger list revision. Newly limited, Confiscation and the Forceful Century. Newly semi-limited, Delinquent Duo and Gravekeeper's Servant. The treasures were the obvious issue, with Duo getting a lesson restriction since it was considered the least powerful of its brothers, given its random element and lack of full hand knowledge. Gravekeeper's Servant was the big mystery here, as nobody played it. This is a slow, low-impact continuous magic that was simply worse than other anti-attack cards, like Swords of Revealing Light and the new Messenger of Peace. Perhaps Konami wanted to sidestep further attack avoidance, or to minimize combos with the new Banisher of Light. Or this was their attempt to ever so slightly weaken deck destruction as it was gaining noticeable momentum. Once the list defined the new meta, hand destruction readjusted back to good stuff, and likewise adapted to the rise of deck destruction by increasing their card count. Maximum deck size wasn't capped at this point, so you could run a 60 card plus build just to counter deck destruction. Sure, consistency would be an issue, however you had triple Painful Choice, plenty of draw cards, and searchers and floaters around to alleviate possible problems. This isn't to say it was just this interaction that stemmed from the July 2000 list, as the power gap left room for lower tier decks to rise up like Maha Vilo, or further experimentation like Cannon Burn, General Beatdown, Attribute decks, Ritual decks, or God forbid you play Tunes. Be thankful Exodia was still severely handicapped. Pharaoh Servant helped close the gap between the 2 destructive decks thanks to Cyberjar, and Megamorph only helped struggling rogue decks. The July list absolutely closed it further, especially after that horrendous May list. All this created a much healthier format post-Magic Ruler Hell. Even if the year so far hasn't had many releases, it's better late than never, as Konami were keeping an eye on if the land would continue to shake. While it's good for now, that will change sooner rather than later as a powerful 3-headed dragon enters the fray, which is something we'll discuss next time. Or lower tier decks to rise up like Maha Vilo, or further experimentation like Cannon Burn, General Beatdown, Attribute, or God forbid you play Tunes.
All right, here we go. Today we have Frank Panessa, one of the 2 undercover DEA agents responsible for the Pizza Connection trial. where the mafia had smuggled over $1.6 billion in heroin from Asia to the U.S. Welcome to Vlad TV.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so you joined the DEA in 1968.
Correct.
What made you want to go into the DEA?
Well, I applied for federal jobs, and at that time, you had to take an exam to be a federal agent, and there were 3 agencies that you could put down that you would be interested in. So I put down the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Secret Service, and U.S. Customs. And then according to your score, when a job was opened up, the agency would call you and offer you, the position. So in '68, I was interviewed by FBM, but by the time I got there in October of '68, they changed the name to BNDD. And BNDD eventually became DEA, all the predecessor things. So I was a street agent in New York, doing cases primarily on the Italians back then, because we didn't have very much information on who the black violators were, but we knew who all the Italians were. And so most of the groups worked on the Italians. And then in the 70s, we found the connection between the Italians on Pleasant Avenue supplying all the blacks in Harlem with the heroin. And so we started concentrating on the blacks. And that went on for a number of years, and I did undercover work into most of the 5 families of New York buying heroin. And then we got information that the Sicilians were taking over complete control of heroin importation. And that was at the time in the late 70s when Carmine Galante got out of jail, and he took over the Bonanno crime family. And the first thing he did was make sure that he controlled all the heroin coming into the United States, so he could turn the spigot on and off and ask for whatever price he wanted. So we had information that they had set up pizza shops all over the Northeast. And one of the main people was down in Philadelphia, and they had like 20 pizza shops, and that's how the name Pizza Connection came about. So we were lucky in arresting 2 wise guys in Philadelphia, and we says, hey, you have to do the right thing or you're going to jail. They said, well, we're not going to give you anybody in the Bruno family. So I says, what about the Sicilians? They says, oh, they're not Italian. Yeah, no problem. So what they did was they went to one of the Sicilians, Alberto Ficalora, and said, hey, we know you got cigarette machines in all these pizza shops and restaurants. He had 80 cigarette machines. You know, when you used to go into a restaurant and you'd have the machine in the vestibule? Well, he had 80 of them. So they said to him, this guy, Frankie Pagano, Frankie Pizza, is in charge of all the hijacking in Philadelphia. And he just had, they just hijacked cigarettes. Would you want to meet him? And so, of course, the Sicilian says, yes, you know. So what they did was we went to a mob restaurant, and the 2 wise guys sat on either side of me. And when the drinks came out, they served me. When the food came out, they served me. So the Sicilians were looking at this, and they're saying, you know, we know these guys are connected with the Bruno family. This guy must be somebody. And so when they introduced me to the Sicilians, and you know, you hear this, but it's true, they said, he's a friend of ours, which means I'm a made guy. If one of the wise guys would have said, he's a friend of mine. That would mean I'm not made. So right off, they accepted me and we started talking about cigarettes. So at the time, they were paying $7.10 a carton to buy the cigarettes legitimately. We, as the government, went out and paid $7.10 a carton and sold it to them for $4 a carton and wrote off the $3 and change as an investigative expense. So that went on for a few months. And finally, one day, I have the sad face, and Ficalora says to me, what's wrong? I says, well, you know, I do white powder too. He says, what are you talking about? He says, we control all the white powder. He says, who you buying from? So thank God I was buying from a guy in the Genovese family that we hadn't arrested yet. So I says, I'm getting it from so-and-so. And he says, he buys from us. From now on, you get it from us. So now I have to convince DEA that these people are major people. And I had, I use the term empty suits. And some of the bosses says, no, these guys are meatballs and all that, you know. Finally, I had one of the bosses in DEA in headquarters who knew me as an agent on the street back in the 60s. And he says, what do you need? I says, well, I need this and that. He says, we'll set up a meeting with Rudy Giuliani, who was at that time the assistant U.S. attorney to Ed Meese. And Rudy says, what do you need, Frank? I says, well, I need another identity. And he says, okay, we'll take care of that. So what they did was they asked me what my last name, what my name was going to be, who's my father's name, who's my mother's name, where I want to be born, what date I want to be born. And sure as hell, if you go to the ledgers in that city, I'm in there, being born on that day. I said I needed a passport in the name of Pagano. And they said, we'll take care of it. Because at that time, when you went over to Europe or to Italy, you had to give your passport when you checked in to the hotel. And they were required to make a copy of it and give it to the questora in that local precinct. So I needed that. And then I said, I need $500,000 in an account. So when they do a D&B on me, in those days they used to do those done in Broad Street, they'd see that I am somebody. And then we had to set up a business. So I set up an import-export company just outside of Philadelphia in Trevose, Pennsylvania. And then what we passport when you checked
So
in,
after I told them I did white powder,
and they were
I
required
also
to make a
got
copy of
penthouse
it
apartment in
restored.
Philadelphia.
In that local
And
precinct.
so they had a place to
I
come
needed
to
that, and then I
when
said,
they wanted to meet.
I need
was living in
500
Bedford, New Jersey at the time.
count.
with my
So when they
family.
do a D&B on
And
me,
what I would do is I'd go to the penthouse
on Broad
apartment,
Street,
park the car downstairs, go up to the apartment, and in those days,
And then we
they
had
did
to
have
set up a
call
business.
forwarding, but it wasn't for John Q.
import-export
Public.
company
But we had
just
it.
outside of
And
Philadelphia.
so I would connect the phone to my house in New Jersey, and it was a phone that only my wife knew to answer, and the kids were told never to answer the phone. And I would go down to the garage, get into a different car, and drive over to Jersey to be with my family. Well, one night I get a call
When you
on the
check
phone, And it's the Sicilian. And this is, oh, we're downstairs. And downstairs in the penthouse. I says, oh, I have my kumare, which means my girlfriend. Why don't I meet you at a restaurant? In about a half hour. And I said, why don't you go to the restaurant? And so now I have to get surveillance. Should only get one agent. So I look up and the Sicilians say, let's go for a ride. So now I'm in the car, three Sicilians, and one surveillance agent following us. And as soon as we go around the corner, he's lost. He loses us. So now the Sicilians start talking about, we don't do lightweight stuff, and so I got indignant. I said, hey, I don't even know you. Don't you tell me you don't make it. So he says, oh, why don't you buy
to see my company. And what we would do, we'd rent trucks, and we had the metal stickums that we put on the side of the trucks that said Prima Import Export, Trevose, Pennsylvania. And so then it was time to go to Germany. And the first time we went over to Italy, I'm waiting for the Sicilians to come over. And they said, no, you have to come back. We can't do anything because we had to kill a judge. And that's when they killed Judge Chinizzi over in Sicily. So the next time we went over, we went to Frankfurt. And I land with the Sicilian, and we go out, and there's this big burly German by a big Mercedes. And he says, Frank, so good to see you, he says. And he says to the Sicilian, see what Frank got me? And now we to see my company and what we would do. We'd rent trucks in Frankfurt, and we had the metal stickers that we put on the side of the truck over the door. We go in, there's this young blonde sitting behind the desk and says, "Oh, Frank, so good to see you. I made the cookies that you like." I'm saying these people are professional. They were the BKA. They were professional. So, of course, the office was wired for sound and video. And what we were going to do was bring the heroin over the northern border into Switzerland and then smuggle it out of my company in Frankfurt, Germany. And this went on. And going back to the United States, whenever there was a shipment taken down, they would say, "Oh, that was our heroin." And if you ever have any problems, we own the Dominican Republic. Because they were laundering a lot of money out of the Dominican Republic in the casinos down there. And so he says, whenever you get in trouble, go down there and we'll take care of you. And that's what happened. There was a shipment of heroin that came in tiles to Buffalo, New York, to a guy by the name of Ragusa. And the DEA seized it, and Ragusa escaped, and that's where he went to the Dominican Republic. But this went on. It was unbelievable. I remember one day I went down into the pizzerias, and on the table are 30 kilos of coke. And he says, "Oh, take some." I says, "Well, I don't get involved in that stuff, He says, "Well, we control the coke, too, in the United States." And so his little son was there, a little 6-year-old. And so I said, in slang, I said, "I feel scumbari, I feel itchy with the kid being here." So he says to the kid, "Paolo, what do you see?" And this little 6-year-old mafioso says, "I see nothing." Mafia in training. So it went on, and then finally the government says, "Well, we're going to take down." Oh, in the meantime, Steve Hobson, we were selling them tomato sauce, cheese, and all that. And Steve Hobson was into one of the Sicilians, and they followed the Sicilian up to New York to pick up a package for Steve, and that's when they got all the people in Brooklyn. And that's how, what we had was, we had 7 people in Philadelphia that they arrested, 7 Sicilians, and was prosecuted in Philadelphia. Then you had the people in New York that were prosecuted in the Southern District. And at that time, Rudy Giuliani was then U.S. Attorney back there, and Louis Freeh, who then became director of the FBI, he was the prosecuting attorney. And everybody got convicted.
Okay, so from what I understand, originally Carlo Gambino started bringing in the Sicilians to do a lot of his dirty work for him.
Correct.
And these guys started to kind of come over, and they would work with the Italian mafia to do various things for them, and they kind of started to build up their own organization in the U.S. as well, right?
Yes, and that's when they started the pizza shops, not only to have a cover, but as a distribution point for heroin. So not only were they used to do hits, they ran the pizza shops and they were distributing heroin.
Okay, and while you're working undercover for these 2 years, you had 22 hits happen around you.
Yeah. Well, that was the time after Bruno that Nicky Scarfo was trying to take over the Philadelphia mob. And from 82 to 84, there were 22 mafia hits, Sal Testa, his son, and a bunch of other people. I remember we used to hang out in an after-hours club in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. It was called Club Enchante, and this is 1983. And you'd have the people from the Bruno mob, you'd have Nicky Scarfo, and then you'd have the Sicilians. And I, of course, was with the Sicilians. And I remember Alberto Ficalora saying to me, you see those two guys over there? And he was pointing to the Salina brothers. He says, they show no respect. And he says, we're men of honor, and they're showing no respect. A month later, both brothers were killed. And that's, it didn't matter to them, you know, they had a particular code, and they stuck to it. And Nicky Scarfo, of course, was a lunatic. He'd kill anybody just to get ahead. So now we're buying heroin from the Sicilians. And they decide they want to take them down, 84, 85. And they said, we're going to get rid of the Sicilian problem. And I said to them, please don't do it. We're getting so much intelligence information from these people. Why take them down? Well, the powers to be wanted to do it. So they say to me, you know, why don't you stiff the Sicilians and see what happens? I says, you have to be kidding me. If I stiff them, they're going to come out and kill me. I owed them, see, they used to give me the heroin on consignment. So I owed them $150,000. And they said, stiff them. So I disappeared. Well, of course, the Sicilians put a contract out on me. And they try to find me every way they could. I used to hang out at a restaurant in Cherry Hill called Sinelli's, and they would say, telephone call for Frank Pagano, and they'd be waiting to see if I went to the phone. The wise guys that introduced me, they says, oh, Frank's going to be at such and such a restaurant in Philadelphia. And sure as hell, there was a van outside the restaurant waiting for me. So now it comes time to arrest them, and the government says, you know, call them up. So I call Paolo Laporta, the main Sicilian, and I said, Paolo, you know, I want to pay you what I owe you. He says, no, that's okay. It's already gone to the collection agency, meaning that the contract was out on me. So the arrests go down, and they find out that I was an undercover agent. And normally, you don't see them until you go to trial. But through their attorney, they wanted, Laporta wanted to see me. And I says, either he's going to threaten me or I don't know. And so the assistant U.S. attorney said, do you want to go see him? I says, I have no problem with it. So what we did, we took pictures of their houses, their wives, their girlfriends, their kids, and everything. And I brought them with me to the jail, and I figured if he's going to threaten me, I'm going to say, you know, there's 12 copies of these pictures, and there's 12 agents that are going to go after your family and everybody. But it didn't work out that way. When I met him, he says, you know, Frank, ours was a gentleman agreement. He says it was a brotherly agreement. He says, but the people that introduced you to me, he says, they have to be held accountable. And so we had to put them in the witness protection program. You know.
Okay, so everything is starting to come to a head. And then in April of 1984, the FBI started to close in on the Sicilian mafia godfather, Gaetano Badalamenti. And this was the top guy in the Sicilian mafia.
Correct.
Now, I guess in 78, there was somewhat of a war that happened in Sicily. And Badalamenti was actually banished from Sicily, but he still continued to run this whole drug operation.
And he went to Brazil. Okay. And also at that time, you had Tommaso Buscetta, who then turned to be against the mafia, and they had the Maxi trials in Sicily where they tried 300 mafioso at once. And I was the go-between between the Italian police and Tommaso. We had him in the witness protection program, and there was only one agent that knew where he was, and he lived next to him. So whenever we wanted Tommaso Buscetta, I would call the agent, and we'd meet somewhere. At the time, they were living in Florida, and we would meet like in New Jersey, and I would bring him money from the Italian police because he testified at the trial. And so I remember one time I brought him $100,000 from the Italians to give him, and I paid it to him in New Jersey. And we used to talk, you know, and he told me, he says, you know, I was a man of honor. He says, you never touched a man's family. He says, they killed my son, my brother, my cousins. He says, they're not men of honor anymore. And finally he flipped, and that's when Judge Falcone came into the picture, who was an unbelievable man. Here was a man that was devoted to getting rid of the mafia. And I worked with Giovanni Falcone.
So Gaetano Badalamenti, he actually joined forces with Salvatore Catalano,
Yes,
who was part of the Bonanno crime family in New York.
in New York and Brooklyn.
Okay. And with this connection, they moved what they say was $1.65 billion in heroin,
Without a doubt.
which originally from the Middle East was imported into New York and then distributed through the United States.
Well, it was also coming in from Italy and Sicily, because what they were doing in the early 80s, they had a guy working at Alitalia in Milan. And that's, in those days, you could send unaccompanied baggage on a plane. I mean, you can't do that today. And so what they would do is they'd have a suitcase that they put heroin in, like 20 kilos, and they'd send it unaccompanied to JFK. Now, they had a baggage handler at Alitalia at JFK. When the baggage came in, he would grab that bag, and that's how they were bringing the heroin in. They were also bringing it in tiles, the pallets of tiles. They were bringing it in tomato cans. They were bringing it in coffee makers, in furniture. But a lot of it was still coming from Sicily. But you're right when you say it was Catalano and Badalamenti. And the way we got Badalamenti is we had wiretaps on his nephew out in the Midwest who had a pizza shop. But the nephew was a real dummy. Badalamenti would try to talk to him in code to say, we're going to meet in such and such a place, you know. And the nephew could never figure out what Badalamenti was saying. Finally, Badalamenti spurted, I'll meet you in Madrid. And that's how they grabbed him, in Madrid.
Okay, and his nephew was Pietro Alfano,
Correct.
who owned a pizzeria in Detroit.
Correct.
So they go and meet up in Madrid. Badalamenti was there with his wife and his son, and the authorities scooped in and arrested him.
Correct.
And then the next day, the FBI hit 30 other mafia members all over the U.S.
Yes. But the thing that I want to bring out, during my undercover activity, once Laporta came to me and he says, look, he says, I need $100,000. He says, could you lend me the $100,000? He says, I'll give you two $50,000 bearer bonds that are getting 13% interest. And so I had to convince the suits in Washington that, hey, he's giving me real bearer bonds, you know. So when it came time for me to give him the bearer bonds back, he said, why don't you keep them? He says, they're getting 13% interest. And when you go to cash them in, we own the guy, the manager of the bank. Okay? Correct. So we take one of the $50,000 bearer bonds, bring it to the bank, And he says, yeah, he says it's worth $48,000, meaning he's going to get $2,000, but there's no IRS forms. And but when I after we arrested the Sicilians, we seized all their records, and we saw that Giovanni Laporta had 5 distributors in Puerto Rico, and we had all the records. So I went down to Puerto Rico, contacted all 5 of them, and said, look, Giovanni was arrested. I know you still owe $20,000. I know he fronted you a half kilo, the other guy. I says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. To show good faith, next week, I'm going to give the stuff to you at such and such a price. So I'll meet you all next Monday here in Puerto Rico. Well, Monday came and nobody showed up. And so when we eventually arrested them, we said, how come you didn't show up that Monday? Because the day after I met them, the real person that took over for the Sicilians had already contacted them to continue business. So we didn't do anything to the Sicilian mafia. They were in business the next day.
So everyone gets arrested, and then the trial officially starts on September 30th, 1985.
Yes.
And when the judge started selecting the jurors, he actually selected them anonymously, so their names were secret, so no one was going to potentially get bought off or killed and so forth.
Exactly. Next week.
So then the trial officially starts on October 24th, 1985, with 22 total defendants, all of them Sicilian. In New York.
Yeah.
Right. This trial would go on to last 16 months, which is the longest criminal jury trial in U.S. history to this day.
But it ended in convictions.
It did. Okay. But then, around 1 month after the start of the trial, Paul Castellano, who was the boss of the Gambinos, ends up getting killed by John Gotti, with Sammy the Bull involved in it also. And I interviewed Sammy, and we went into the whole details of it. September 30th, when that happened, did that set some sort of stigma on the trial with the craziness that was happening outside the trial?
No. It had really nothing to do with the trial. We had solid evidence from wiretaps and Steve Hobson buying the heroin from Catalano and those people in New York, and me buying the heroin from the other Sicilians connected with Cesare Bonaventure and Catalano. So it didn't have any bearing on it. Not that I saw.
Okay, but then by 1987, as the trial is progressing, on February 12th, the cousin of the main Sicilian boss, who we talked about, Pietro Alfano, was walking with his wife carrying groceries in Greenwich Village in New York, and 3 guys show up and actually shoot him in the head.
Yeah, because they were afraid he was going to cooperate. I used to call him Buffono Alfano. He was a buffoon, and so I think they saw that, and they weren't going to take any chances. Because the government was actively trying to flip him, to be an informant. From the other Sicilians connected with Cesare Bonaventure.
Okay, and from what I understand, it was a $40,000 hit on him, and 3 men were later arrested for the murder, who I guess were part of the Gambino crime family.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then Pietro Alfano ends up getting killed in the middle of the trial, and at that point, the judge actually sequestered the jury, which meant that he put them in hotel rooms in order to protect them.
Yes.
Okay, so the trial's dragging on, and it's finally coming to its conclusion, and the lawyers are starting to, are trying to defend their clients the best they can, but it's not going very well. And as the jury is starting to deliberate, one of the jurors actually received a threatening phone call and ended up excusing themselves from the trial because they were too scared they might get killed over being a jury member.
But you had the alternates.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and from what I understand, $40,000 hit. After the jury deliberated, all 19 defendants were convicted. Badalamenti and Catalano both got 45 years. Ends up getting killed in the middle of the trial. Since Badalamenti was actually extradited from Spain, there was a deal in place that he would actually get a maximum of 30 years. But he ended up dying in prison in 2004 at age 80, which is 13 years before he would have actually gotten out.
Yeah.
Are trying to defend their. You took the stand in the trial. Best they can, but it's not going
Excuse
very
me.
well. Did you take the stand
I
in the
took
trial?
the stand in Philadelphia. See what they did? They split it up. You know, it was a turf war. Who was going to get all the defendants? So they decided all the deals that I did in Philadelphia, they would try all those people in Philadelphia.
Okay.
Steve Hobson testified in New York, and we were the only undercover agents that actually bought heroin from the Sicilians.
Okay. And from what I understand, this was sort of a very monumental trial for the FBI in terms of working with other agencies, working internationally, setting up departments in other countries, which even to this day, with all the cyber crimes and everything else, like the work from that trial is still being used today.
Yeah. See, you have to understand that at that time, DEA was already in 50 different countries. We had established ourselves back in FBN and BNDD. The FBI then finally was able, with their legats, to go into the different countries. And it worked out real well for them because then they got into the cyber crimes and all that. They did some narcotic cases in Europe, but primarily it was us and customs working overseas because they sent me over and I was narcotic attaché for 3 years from 88 to 91, and I was chief U.S. advisor to the Italian police agencies on narcotics, and that's when I worked with Giovanni Falcone, and unfortunately he was murdered with his wife in 91. And he was such a devoted person. The FBI even offered him a job in Washington to be their man on the mafia, but he just didn't want to leave Italy.
Well, in 1989, undercover DEA agent Everett Hatcher was meeting with a Bonanno Mafia associate, Gus Faraci.
No, he was meeting with John Gotti's, one of John Gotti's people. Now, Everett Hatcher, I did undercover work for. He was a real gentleman. Okay? And so what had happened, he was doing undercover into Faraci. And from the beginning, Faraci was going to rip him off. And he shows up with the money and Faraci kills him. Okay. So now we know it's Faraci and we can't find him. So on an early Sunday morning, the head of DEA in New York goes to Gotti's house, knocks on the door, and he says, now one of your people are going to move. I'm going to have an agent walking side by side of all your people if you don't give up Gus Faraci. You know, so Gotti must have figured that if he gives up Faraci, Faraci's liable to flip. So Gotti's people killed Faraci. Real gentleman. Okay.
Right, and there ended up being this national manhunt for Faraci, which they actually made movies out of. The movie Out for Justice with Steven Seagal is actually based on Gus Faraci's manhunt.
He shows up
Right, like in the process of them trying to find Faraci, Faraci actually had a mentor in the mafia with the Bonanno family, a capo named Jerry Chili Sr.
Yeah.
He wanted to kill Faraci, and he gave the hit to a new mob associate with the Lucchese family named John Petruccelli. Petruccelli actually refused to kill him. And then 2 months later, they found Petruccelli dead with a hood over his head, which is a Sicilian message for never keep secrets from the family.
Yeah.
So it was really kind of a mess, this whole Faraci mafia situation. And
Everett Hatcher was such a nice guy. As I say, I did undercover work for him. Cases that he made, I went undercover. And it was a shame to be taken like that.
Right, and ultimately they actually found Faraci dead with another guy who had also gotten shot. I guess the way they got shot was similar to the way the Faraci actually killed the DEA agent. He wanted to kill Faraci. And ultimately they found the three guys. Well, they found two guys who were involved in it, and the third guy was already dead by the time they actually found him. Well, and then in 1985, there was the murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena, which was actually kidnapped by drug traffickers hired by Mexican politicians.
Yes.
In Mexico.
Yes.
He ended up being interrogated and tortured and ultimately killed.
Yes.
Did you know Kiki at all?
I knew Kiki. I met Kiki, but I didn't work with him. But when he was kidnapped, they brought me into headquarters to work on the desk because we set up a special desk to try to find him. We knew that he was taken. And I must say, every government agency went out of their way to try to find Kiki. I mean, the agency with their satellites, taking pictures of the farm that we thought he might be on, and it was an all-out effort. And finally, when they investigated it, they got to it, and all these years later, they finally got everybody that was involved in it.
Right, and from what I understood, it kind of strained U.S.-Mexican relations over the situation.
Oh, yes. But that's happened so many times. You know, there's so much money to be made. I knew Kiki. I met Kiki.
Right, and just recently, I guess they had actually recaptured one of the drug traffickers involved in that case, Rafael Caro Quintero.
Yes, they did. We knew that he was taken.
Right, he was recaptured in July of this year.
I must say, every government agency went out of their way.
These types of situations where DEA agents get killed and kidnapped and so forth, does it happen very often? I mean, when you're going undercover, you're taking the risk of this happening at any moment.
You know, you have to plan each case. You have to see who you're dealing with. And you have to know everything about them. And if you have a sixth sense, if you feel that something is wrong, you just don't meet with them. And that's how I kept alive, you know, because it would only take one person to tell the Sicilians that I was an agent, and I'd be gone. You know, the same with when I was working on the Colombians. All it would take is and they had the money. They bought judges, they bought cops. You know, so you had to plan ahead. You had to know who you were dealing with. And you sort of had to have like a sixth sense. If something wasn't right, you didn't get involved in it. But I was pretty lucky with the Sicilians for the simple reason I was a cash cow for them. You know, I bought over $1 million worth of heroin from them, so they didn't want anything to happen to me. The Colombians were something else. They'd kill you in a second. And whenever I dealt with the Colombians, you know, I was extra cautious. I remember doing a deal with them. I had an undercover Learjet with two DEA agent pilots. and we would fly to Teterboro Airport to a section called Millionaire, and that's where all the private jets came in. And we had a judge in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who gave us wiretap authorization on 3 cell phones. So when I met the Colombian, we take off from Teterboro and we're flying around, and I says, oh, why don't we land in Harrisburg and have some lunch or something? So we go there, and I'm getting off the plane, and I say to the Colombian, those are 3 new phones, so use any one you want if you have to call your people. And sure as hell he did. And we got a take on where he was calling, But then they wanted to meet me in El Salvador, and in all the countries I've been in, you feel like your life isn't worth a nickel. They kill you for a nickel in El Salvador. And so whenever anybody came up to me, they'd say, oh, are you American? And I'd start talking Italian, saying, no, I'm Italian, But again, with the Sicilians, they were one tough group, millions and millions of dollars. And when you say billions, it's the truth. It's the actual truth. People didn't realize the magnitude of it. If you were to tell people, hey, I was involved in one cell that was bringing in $1 million a day, they'd say, oh, come on. No, it's true. That's how much money they were making.
2 years after you joined the DEA, in 1970, that's when the RICO laws were enacted.
Yes. Yes, they were.
And that was really to try to bust the Italian mafia, right?
It was. It was. And it was very effective.
Well, you fast forward to 2022, RICO has been used all over the place with lots of different groups and so forth.
Of course.
Right now in the hip hop world, one of the biggest cases is there's a crew of rappers and associates in Atlanta, named YSL. Some of the rappers are like Young Thug and Gunna and so forth. 28 of them are now locked up over a state RICO case, involving drugs, murders, gangs, and so forth. Yeah. In this case, hip-hop lyrics are in the indictment. Social media posts are in the indictment. Now, this is a state RICO case rather than a federal RICO case. From your understanding, what's the difference between state and federal RICO?
Well, are you talking about Georgia?
Yes.
Did you say? It's fashioned after the federal. So there's very little difference. They legislated it to be like the federal. And it's a heavy law, and if they have them, it's a tough case to beat, a RICO case. It really is.
I mean, when you look at cases like this, in all the years that you've worked on them,